Welcome to Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear, where integrative oncology meets holistic healing. This podcast is your home for the latest in innovation, exploration, and elevation in all areas of integrative oncology, medicine, health, wellness, and beyond. Join me and a host of other innovators as we go from practicing to prescribing. Your daily dose of wellness begins now. Welcome to another Hot Take with Dr. Nathan Goodyear. I like to go across social media and just kind of see what are people talking about? What's the public consciousness and what's the battle for the narrative? And there always seems to be certain points that are fulcrum for that battle. And of course, ivermectin has been one since really 2019. Interesting enough, before 2019, it wasn't really an issue, right? And then 2019 came along. We all know what that was. And that then changed everything as it relates to ivermectin. But when you look at ivermectin, what was happening last week all throughout social media was this concept that ivermectin is safer than Tylenol. That's what everybody was saying. Now, they were doing so in context with a 2024 review. And this was entitled A Review of Ivermectin Use in Cancer Patients. Is it time to repurpose ivermectin in cancer treatment? It was a 2024 comprehensive literature review. It looked at in vitro, in vivo, it looked at clinical reports, even some limited clinical trials. So it got me to thinking, when you look at this comprehensive literature review, did it tie in with the statement that ivermectin is safer than Tylenol? Now, when we look at ivermectin, of course, FDA approved 1987, approved for animal use before that, I've talked about this before, and I encourage you to check out the course Outcoming on Repurposed Medications in Oncology, which is a deep dive in all things repurposed medication oncology, of which doesn't exist out there. We dive into the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics and just go all deep, human equivalent dosing, etc. So check out on pre-scribe.com or other venues. But when you look at ivermectin, I've described how it was first a wonder drug. It was described repeatedly as a wonder drug. Then it became a wonder dog because it moved into the veterinarian world and then throughout the veterinarian world. Then it became a wonder dud as the battle for the narrative through the pandemic really took control of the narrative around ivermectin. Then it came back to a wonder cancer drug, which probably was there all along. And as I've said before, I've been using this since 2017 in the integrative oncology arena, treating cancer patients, but I've been using it as a repurposed medication there. Let's go through just a little bit of what we know about ivermectin very quickly, because we have to understand that the broad mechanisms, anti-cancer mechanisms of ivermectin are becoming very well known and very solidified. Ivermectin inhibits cell proliferation. It promotes apoptosis, programmed cell death, autophagy. It's anti-angiogenic. It inhibits DNA repair. It actually disrupts key oncogenic signaling pathways such as WNT, beta-catenin, AKT, mTOR signaling. It suppresses cancer stem cell viability. It reduces metastasis. It modulates molecular targets simultaneously. So it's not just a kind of hit here. It's hitting multiple targets all over the place at the same time. It modulates the tumor microenvironment. It's immunomodulatory. Actually, ivermectin's been shown to make cold tumors, which are non-immune responsive, hot, meaning immune infiltrative and immune responsive. It augments immunotherapy, and it's a chemosensitizer. So it's sensitizing tumors to chemotherapy where it has become resistant. The concept here, the question at hand is ivermectin safer than Tylenol? So let's look at very briefly the safety profile of ivermectin. What do we know about it? Well, the predominant literature on the safety profile of ivermectin is actually related to its use as an antiparasitic. It has been used to treat billions of individuals over many decades, and this has shown it to be very, very safe. Now, we have to recognize that the use of ivermectin as an antiparasitic is a very short dosing strategy. It's not something that's taken, week after week, month after month for years. And when you look at cancer, that is the difference. Cancer is a longer treatment strategy than is an antiparasitic strategy. So we can't say exactly that, hey, because it's been shown to be safe as an antiparasitic in the short dosing interval, that it has been incredibly safe. I mean, very safe. But does that translate to long term? We don't know that. What about the dosing difference? Because when we're looking at the dosing as an antiparasitic, the way it's being advocated as a treatment for the dosing in cancer, they are different. And what we don't know is, does that difference make a difference in the safety profile? And honestly, when you look at the literature, there's still question about what's the optimal dosing of ivermectin in cancer, but also what's the optimal sequencing of dosing. Is it something that needs to be taken every day? Is it something that needs to be cycled on, cycled off? These are questions still yet to be determined. It doesn't mean it can't be a safely applied repurposed medication in oncology. It just means there's still questions to be determined. And when we look at cancer patients that have actually taken ivermectin, but for the treatment of parasitic infection, it's been shown to be safe and well tolerated there. But again, it's in that short window of dosing because it's being employed there as an antiparasitic. When we look at long-term dosing of ivermectin in cancer, it's been shown to be well tolerated. Now, well tolerated doesn't necessarily translate to no toxicity, because we have to recognize even water can be toxic. Everybody advocates for fasting, and that's all great, and water is essential to life, but even fasting can be toxic. You can fast yourself to death. I mean, state the obvious, but food is essential to our body's metabolism and thriving and living, but food can be toxic. So we have to recognize everything in context can be good, and almost everything in context can be bad. So we have to recognize that. So just because it's been shown to be long-term dosing in cancer being well tolerated, that doesn't necessarily tell us it's safe, and especially doesn't tell us it's safer than Tylenol. What we are hopefully going to find soon is human pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic information that further elevates our understanding of how to use this in cancer. And understand, when we talk about the positives of ivermectin or other repurposed medications in oncology, we also have to focus on the negative, meaning most of that's the limitation of research. That's just science. Science is never that all answers are done, complete. Everything's answered. That's not science. Science is a constantly opening of doors, new ideas, new concepts. And honestly, it gets down to critical thinking, which unfortunately, in today's day and time, we're getting less and less of that. But what we're going to see is that I think new information coming that's going to better help us to dose ivermectin and better dose it with other therapeutics, because that's where ivermectin shines as a whole. Back to the question, is ivermectin safer than Tylenol? There's no comparison study. So there's been no study to show the two. And you may go, oh, come on, that's trivial. No, it's real. We have to be honest. But when we talk about Tylenol, when Tylenol is used over the counter, and when it's used as indicated, it's safe. It's when Tylenol is used over the counter, not as indicated. That's when it becomes a big, big problem. And then when it's used in conjunction with other medications and other supplements that the doctor that made the recommendation or the patient that decided to take the Tylenol, that's where the water starts to get muddied. And that's where you start to see an increase of risk. Because just because it's available over the counter doesn't mean everybody looks at the bottle and goes, oh, that's exactly how I take it. No, in American and Western culture, we go, wow, if 1 every 6 hours is great, I bet 4 every 6 hours is fantastic. And then I'm taking all this other stuff I didn't tell my doctor about, fenbendazole, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that taxes the liver. And all of a sudden you go to the ER and your liver's, your liver enzymes are out the wazoo and you're in abdominal pain. And the doc goes, well, what are you doing? So we have to recognize everything in context. Tylenol's safe when used. But when used as non-indicated, it can be unsafe and used in conjunction. But when we look at ivermectin, okay, when ivermectin is used as indicated, as prescribed as a whole, it's very, very safe. So what happens if it then moves over the counter, which it's doing in some states, and then as in Tylenol, people start to use it not as indicated? They start to mix it with other drugs, other supplements, and their doctor or other doctors aren't aware of what they're doing, and prescriptions are prescribed that further tax the liver as they're taking ivermectin or vice versa. Well, that's where we're going to start to see something that is proven very safe when given as indicated becomes not safe because it's being used not as indicated. So it equally applies to the Tylenol. Now, here's the concern, and I've actually seen this a couple times. I had a colleague that prescribed ivermectin to a patient, and it was prescribed based on weight. The patient, without the doctor's knowledge, then gave ivermectin to a sibling. The sibling took the ivermectin, don't know how it was taken, whether it was taken as prescribed in the bottle or just taken, but that brother, who was brother of the patient, was not evaluated. So, no knowledge was known of that patient's metabolism, that is the liver detoxification, other medications the patient was taking, supplements, you get what I'm talking about. And so that patient ended up in the ER in a coma 2 days later, but of course they took the patient off the ivermectin, but 2 days later the patient woke up. Rare but real. I've seen a patient actually have a seizure in the office. This is a patient with brain metastasis on ivermectin. Patient was taking more dose than was intended by the prescription because they had read online about dosing much, much higher. Now, what I'm talking about here is the neurological side effects, the neurotoxicity potential of ivermectin. Very rare. Most people will look at ivermectin and say, well, it can cause hypotension, GI side effects, and skin rashes. And that's going to be mostly what you see. But here, the neurotoxicity are things like ataxia, which is loss of coordination, slurred speech, fine motor skill disruption, and then dizziness, confusion, seizures, and coma. So the seizures and the coma are something that I've seen. The seizures, coma is one I described in that case. Ivermectin doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier very well. So that's why when ivermectin is given as indicated, it rarely causes any of those symptoms, is because it just doesn't cross that blood-brain barrier well. And that's because there's a transporter called the P-glycoprotein, or MDR1, and it transports it out. But when you take really high doses, you can overwhelm that transporter, and thus ivermectin will not only get across the blood-brain barrier, the levels will accumulate there, and then that's where you'll start to get some potential for neurotoxicity. Again, still low, but very, very real. And this is why I tell patients, if you have brain mets or primary like brain tumors like glioblastoma, mebendazole, that's mebendazole with an M for mom, it's going to do a better job of crossing that blood-brain barrier. So back to the question at hand, is ivermectin safer than Tylenol? When used as indicated, I would say it's probably as safe as Tylenol when Tylenol is used as indicated. Now, in some states, politicians have authorized, whether they know it or not, an observational study. Is ivermectin safe? Yes. Is ivermectin going to be safe over the counter? We shall see. I hope it is, and I think it will be, but there's some people out there that advocate for super, super crazy dosing of ivermectin, and then, Western human culture, again, if one is good, 4 is great. If 18 milligrams per day is great, I bet 180 milligrams is even better. And that's the kind of philosophy that kind of permeates our culture that can create some challenge with things over the counter. So it'll be interesting to see what we see with this observational study that politicians have authorized. In the integrative world, we physicians have to be very clear and concise with the data that we discuss. We have to discuss the pros, the positives, and we have to discuss the cons, the negatives, the limitations. And even though we discuss a negative, a con, a limitation, doesn't mean that overall the benefits outweigh the risks. We also have to be very clear and concise and honest in the words that we use. Because if we're describing the data and then we make, I think, superfluous and grandiose statements of ivermectin is safer than Tylenol, I think we undermine actually what is a great effective therapy as a repurposed medication in oncology, because we're propagating a narrative that's not necessarily supported in the science today. One day it may, but again, if ivermectin's taken as indicated, and if ivermectin is taken along with other things not as indicated, there could be problems. And I've given you a couple examples. But if Tylenol's taken as indicated, it's very safe. That's why it's over the counter. But if ivermectin is taken as indicated, it's very safe as well. You can see how when it's taken as indicated, as prescribed, as the evidence guides, both can be safe. But when both are taken outside of those parameters, then that's where the problem arises. So we have to be honest with our statements. And so saying that ivermectin is safer than Tylenol, honestly, I don't think we can say that. I think what we can say, and this is where I'll close, is that both ivermectin and Tylenol, when taken as indicated, whether over the counter or behind the counter, that's by prescription, they're safe. But when taken not as indicated, then that's where toxicity, side effects, increase. That's another hot take by Dr. Nathan Goodyear. I'll see you on the next hot take. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Prescribe Podcast. All references supporting this episode can be found on the prescribe.com website. That's pre-scribe.com. To get your next dose of medical innovation, make sure you subscribe to Prescribe. We'll see you for your next refill.